Hi, I'm Madeline James, and welcome to part 2 of my interview with the wonderful Guy Windsor. If you haven't already, go back and watch part 1 first. It will be linked down below. And another quick reminder about the trigger warning for these videos. We will be discussing historical sword fighting to include injuries, some discussions of which are a little bit graphic. It's not very gory, but if anyone is particularly sensitive to that sort of thing, this is not the video for you. And with that out of the way, let's get started. I hope you don't have any personal experience with this, but do you have any idea through research or knowing anyone or having experience with it yourself, like what it feels like in the heat of the moment when you're in that high adrenaline situation, like when you get hit with a sword?
I mean, for real?
Mm-hmm.
Like someone's like sliced you open with a sword? I
Right.
mean, generally speaking, either you won't feel it,
Mm-hmm.
right, because it's a cut. If it hits you hard
Mm-hmm.
and say like, bashes into your bone, you will
Mm-hmm.
feel it like a very hard whack with a stick,
Okay.
generally speaking. But I can't speak to that with any authority, and most of that comes from um, people who end up like injured in a woodworking shop, for example.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I know of people who were working a piece of wood and they look down, and the wood is covered in blood, and they have no idea where it came from. And they look at their hand, and half of the finger's gone
Oh, wow.
because they're using a spindle molder, one of these
Right.
hideous machines that spins a blade extremely fast. That's not comparable to a sword blow because the
Mm-hmm.
speed makes a lot of difference. But it's certainly possible to, I mean, famously, what was the guy's name? Battle of Waterloo. Wellington is there on his horse with one of his generals or aide de camp or something, and the chap next to him gets his leg blown off with a cannonball,
Mm-hmm.
and he looks down and goes, "By gad, sir, I've lost my leg." And Wellington looks over and goes, "By gad, sir, so you have."
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that may be apocryphal, but there are examples of people not noticing or not being immediately incapacitated by things that you would think would incapacitate
They
you,
would know.
because adrenaline is a thing, and you can, you know, pain is your brain's response to paying attention to a bunch of signals. The signals
Mm-hmm.
may be there, but if your brain isn't paying attention to them, you won't notice them.
Right. It gives a lot more credence to all of those scenes where, your party of whatever main characters and whoever gets into like a fight, and then they narrowly mistake and you think everything's fine, and then right after someone's like, oh, I'm bleeding, oh no, and
Yeah.
then it's like this
No.
dramatic thing, like,
That's realistic.
yeah, wow. i
I mean,
i
I
always
know
thought it was overly dramatized.
I mean, I have a friend who has helped police forces with like one-on-one stuff, interpersonal violence sort of thing. And one of the students, a police officer, was subsequently assaulted by someone with a knife, and they recognized it as a stabbing because it was multiple light hits that didn't seem to do anything.
Mm,
And they realized they were being stabbed and did something about it and survived to tell the story to my friend, the instructor,
mm,
right? But that's like multiple stab wounds to the abdomen.
right.
And they didn't realize they were being stabbed until they recognized it from a training session.
Right, like from a logical perspective of, oh, if
Yeah.
they were actually hitting me with like a fist, that would have felt different, like,
Yeah. They had to kind of work
huh.
it out because it was like these multiple light hits as opposed to, well, a few heavy ones or whatever.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's I'll have to ruminate on that a bit because
Yeah.
it's very interesting, all the things that you could play around with that, like especially in storytelling and stuff. There's a lot of
Yeah.
room for
And
interest there.
there's a ton of medical literature on, the effects of wounds,
Mm-hmm.
and what people can reasonably be expected to do after certain wounds have been received.
Right.
Um, and like if you get stabbed through the heart, right? The big difference,
Mm.
I went to a lecture by a pathologist about this sort of thing, and this is what he said, right? If your heart is in the contraction phase when the thing goes through it,
Mm.
as it relaxes, it will start to leak, but you have some time and survival is quite possible. I mean, there are people who've been shot through the heart who have survived.
Oh,
If it
wow.
is in the expansion phase, when the thing hits it, it explodes, all the blood goes everywhere, and you're dead. Right? So,
Wow.
and there's a 50-50 chance of it being one or the other.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like, it's putting it in really bad, but it's the taking it out. If it hasn't like gone right, it's the taking it out where they bleed to death. Like I've seen, because I used to study like biology and medicine and stuff,
Mm.
and I've seen like the pictures from the surgery where this kid fell in a quarry and he got
Mm.
this basically this steel pipe went in above his hip and out through his shoulder, going straight through his heart.
Mm.
Right?
Mm.
And the fire service sort of cut off both ends of the pipe and put him on a trolley and took him to the hospital. And the surgeon who was giving
Right.
the lecture, they managed to basically pull it out a little bit, stitch up, pull it out a little bit, stitch up, or what. I can't remember exactly how they did it. But the thing is, he survived. He was fine.
That's
Right? Having
crazy.
had literally a inch round pipe go all the way through his body, through his heart. Because while it was in there and the heart was, of course, beating, of course, they got him on bypass and stuff when they had to
Right.
take it
Right.
out. But, and this is entirely, survival in this is entirely dependent on modern medicine, right? They
Right.
couldn't do this in the
Yeah.
Middle Ages, right? But,
No.
but basically, the piece of metal was sealing the wound. So while it was leaking a bit, he wasn't losing that much blood that fast,
Mm.
right? So he survived.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's so, you know, if it ever happens to you in training that you accidentally stick a sword through somebody's leg, leave it there.
Right. Don't pull it out.
Leave it there. Do not pull it out. Let the doctors take it out. Top tip.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So,
crazy.
yeah, I'm not quite sure how we got onto that, but
I mean, talking about experience, like, that's all
yeah.
great. Like,
But I
it's
mean,
good things
and
to
the
think about and be
literature's out
aware
there.
of.
I mean, you
Yeah.
can look this stuff up on PubMed. It's
Right.
these scientific papers are there, and they record all these amazing things, and yeah, you
Mm-hmm.
can find out quite a lot of information there about the effects of
Mm-hmm.
wounds.
So, as sort of a wrap up for that section, is there
Mm-hmm.
anything that you see commonly either in books or shows or the discussions of sword fighting where there's any like details, like tactile type details, sensory details that are particularly like interesting or like underrepresented that people wouldn't mostly be aware of?
You can't really see it. Movies don't give you this. Books are better at talking about that kind of sensory experience.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, generally, it goes to the clash and the bash when it shouldn't. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's far too much impact going on for a sword fight. And yeah, okay, if you're fighting with sticks or you're in armor and fighting with impact weapons like poleaxes, there's going to be a lot more of that. But
Mm-hmm.
um, it's of a piece with these are not clumsy people using clumsy tools. These are sophisticated martial artists using sophisticated weapons.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that tends to be where writers annoy me when they do.
Right. Right. So, next question then. So, in the heat of battle, right?
Mhm.
Obviously, we've talked a lot
Which I've
about
never been in.
how,
Which I've never been
right,
in. Just for the record.
important
Yeah,
clarification.
yeah.
But like in the heat of battle, when you have that adrenaline, right, rushing through you, at what point do you have to start worrying about this, like the exhaustion versus adrenaline and someone's ability to push through that exhaustion due to the adrenaline?
Okay. If you're thinking about adrenaline, you're not adrenalized,
Okay.
right? So
Mm-hmm.
what tends to happen this is from reading accounts of military actions and whatnot. In the battle, everyone has no problem staying awake because they are, hyper adrenalized. Then, when there's a lull, let's say a platoon has taken an objective, right, and they're not currently under any actual direct pressure from the enemy, right? The sergeant's main job in that situation is to keep everyone awake, because the parasympathetic backlash, like they are hyper, like awake, with adrenaline and other hormones keeping them like super alert, cortisol being a big one. Then when they get into a situation where their lizard brain thinks they're safe, they crash, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, literally, the enemy could come up and find them asleep, right? They're quiet.
Isn't super great?
Not great. So that's where like discipline comes is in dealing with the come down from the adrenaline, where if you need to keep going, but you're not currently under that sort of threat that keeps you awake naturally. And the modern army, particularly the modern American army, I have friends in the modern American army, and they are all entirely caffeine junkies. Like the amount of caffeine these people consume is just unbelievable. And you'd think that they would be like sufficiently stimulated by the environment, but apparently not. So the people you should talk to for that question would be soldiers, particularly soldiers who have actual combat experience, because I can only tell you like bits of stuff that I've read, and what friends in the military have told me. But I mean, I can put you in touch with some soldiers if you need some.
Yeah, I'll have to sit and think about it, because I know a few, but I'll have to think of, because it's definitely something you don't want to just be like, oh, hey, answer this question for me. You want to make sure they're okay talking about that sort of stuff and experiences. So I'll have to do some thinking on whether or not to broach it.
If you say I'm writing the scene in a book, and there's this thing about how they're responding to the stress of battle with being hyper alert and then crashing or whatever.
Right.
Would you mind casting an eye over it and tell me if it reads true to you? That
makes sense. Yeah.
Rather than please share your possibly very private experience.
Yeah.
But could you just please read this thing that I've written and let me know if it sets off your bullshit alarms.
Right. I like that. Yes. Okay. That's a good idea.
It's a better way to pitch it.
Yeah, I like it. That is definitely much better. I always get like, a little nervous with that kind of stuff, but that's very easy to just, hey, would you mind? And if they're like, oh, that might be too triggering for me, I can't do it, then it's like, okay, great. Fine. No problem. Yeah. Okay, so my next little group of questions has to do with like the less glamorous side of sword fighting. So like for warriors or soldiers or, guards or whomever, needing to do the maintenance and storage and stuff for their swords. Because you see a lot of journeys where, they're going somewhere on their horses and they're not, like in little parties and groups. And the first question for that is, how often would they have to clean and maintain their blades when they're, say, on a journey, right?
Depends on the weather.
Okay.
I mean, I have done sort of countryside trips with swords, and you're cleaning your sword every day if it's damp. Maybe less often if it's dry. But again, any kind of military unit or any sort of trained professionals will have a routine for this.
Okay.
Right? So it's not, it's not like, I wonder if my sword needs cleaning. It's been a week. It's like they'll have a schedule for it. And when we make camp for the evening, we get the wood for the campfire, we sort out the food, we get the tent sorted out, we do these things. And at some point in that evening routine, there will be the equipment check, necessary maintenance. Because it's not just keeping the sword clean and sharp. There's also, because the sword is not the primary weapon usually.
Right.
There'll also be things like um, making sure your boots are waterproof, repairing like bits of like leather straps or whatever that are broken or are wearing out. Um, there's all the horses' tack if they're using horses, right?
Mm-hmm.
All the care that goes in looking. Have you ever ridden?
A horse, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So 90% of horse riding isn't actually sitting on the horse. It's doing all the other crap that horses need, right? And
Mm-hmm.
sorting out all the gear and all that sort of thing, right? So there's that. And there's, foraging for food and making sure the kitchen areas and stuff and digging the pit for the latrine and, all these tasks, which will be a
Mm-hmm.
normal part of the evening when you get to camp in this particular environment,
Right.
right? And that's still true today. I mean, there are units of the British armed services which have what's called boot order, which is in a patrol, which is usually 4 people. If they're out doing squirrely stuff for a few days, at no time is there more than 1 boot off in the patrol. Right? So no one takes their boots.
Okay.
They don't get to camp or whatever, take their boots off and all sit around and relax. At any given
Right.
time, there's only 1 boot off 1 foot. So you need to look after your feet,
Mm-hmm.
right? And read accounts of officers from the First World War. Half of their job is making sure their men's feet stay dry, right? It's a
Okay.
huge part of being an effective soldier is being keeping your feet in operating condition, right?
Right. You
So
need those.
and if you've been, I don't know, sort of charging around over hilly terrain for 20 hours and you're stopping for a sleep or whatever, people need to sort out their feet, but they go foot by foot.
Mm-hmm.
So that if something bad happens, there's only one person who needs to put on 1 boot for everyone to be shot.
Right.
So
That makes
but
sense.
but like in like base camp somewhere behind back in your home country or wherever, different rules apply.
Right. Right.
So
You're not in
what
a dangerous.
Yeah. So what you will do and how you will do it will be determined by the tactical situation.
Mm-hmm.
How safe is it? How much time can
Mm-hmm.
you spend? I mean, there's a reason why the Romans, when they marched 20 miles, stopped, built an entire fortified camp with wooden walls around it,
Uh-huh.
right? Right? Did all of their stuff, then took it all down the next day and went off to the next place.
Yeah.
Right? They were super disciplined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
It's a huge amount of work, and part of that,
Mhm.
if they had a high-ranking general with them, would be there'd be a cart which had the mosaic floor for the general's tent, right? So in
Yeah.
that context, keeping your sword clean and sharp is a minor part of the whole camp routine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think a lot of depictions of scenes in like marching armies that are like going someplace through enemy territory definitely a lot more chill than they would have been.
Yeah,
Which
yeah. I mean, and they should be like in groups but separated out. So if an ambush strikes, you can only get 1 group at a time, and the other group can come up
Mm,
in reserve, and the group ahead can come back, and
okay.
right. So which incidentally, funnily enough, the Finns did the reverse of
Okay.
in the Winter War, right? Where
Okay.
you have these Russian columns far too big to attack. So what they would do is they would split them up into a small chunk, destroy that chunk, and then disappear into the forest. It was called the motte,
Okay.
right?
Yeah,
The little chunk that they cut them up into. So
that's cool.
yeah,
So, how often would blades need to be sharpened?
it depends how much you use them and what you're using them for.
Right.
So, and also what they're made of. Like, it
Mm.
is probable that a bronze sword was remade, in other words, melted down and recast, pretty much every time it got into a fight,
Huh. Okay.
right? Because they're very fragile, they're very soft,
Uh,
right? So when you're bish bash boshing with bronze swords, they don't last for very long. Even if
mhm.
you're just, even if you're lucky and you hit mostly person, you're still going to like catch the edge of their shield, or there's going to be a parry edge against edge, or whatever, and it causes all sorts of damage to the blade. And maybe they had a couple of battles in them, but probably not more than that.
Right. That
Steel
makes sense.
sword, a steel sword is likely to do much better, but it only has to be left out in the wrong environment for a day or a week or a month, depending on the environment, for the sword to be rusted so badly it's useless.
Yeah.
So a lot of it comes down to prevention. So keeping the weapon greased. Goose fat is apparently very good for that sort of thing.
Okay.
And like the inside of armor is very often treated with linseed oil, which is then heated so it polymerizes. The same way that you season a cast iron frying pan. They were doing
Okay.
thicker versions of that on the inside of plate armor to keep the rust out.
Right.
But
That makes sense.
it's basically plastic, right?
Right. Yeah.
When the oil polymerizes, you basically get a plastic layer over the steel. You wouldn't do that to blades because the heat would damage the heat treat on the blade itself. And there's a whole class of armor where you couldn't do that because, again, the heat would damage the tempering of the armor.
Okay.
But they really thought about these things a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. They would have to.
Right. And again, the sword's not the primary weapon, so they're also looking after spears and poleaxes and bows and arrows and whatnot. And arrows for an army, arrows were usually transported in barrels, right?
Okay.
By the tens of thousands, right? So there's not
I
like
mean,
a hunter will have the arrows. Someone who does like modern bow hunting but with traditional archery equipment, they will have their special arrows that they've made to fit that bow perfectly with the right spine weight and all that sort of stuff, and they're beautiful hunting arrows. In the military, you use the ammunition you're given, right?
right.
So these archers at Agincourt, for instance, are using issued arrows, which all have like spine weight probably within a certain set of parameters, and they would tend to be more or less the same weight, but it massively affects accuracy.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, a really good archer is not just a really good archer with this bow and these arrows. They should be a really good archer with bows of this type and arrows within this range of variation. We got a little bit off topic there, I think, but I don't mind if you don't.
Sort of still high level on topic.
Okay.
The next question is, so obviously in like armies, there's a lot of very specialized ways like you talked about of how the gear and everything gets transported. But if you have like a smaller party where say you're mostly carrying all your own stuff, if you're traveling on horseback, where does everything go? Like, are you wearing your shield, your swords, or is your spears
generally, okay. Generally speaking, stuff that can be packed onto the backs of mules or donkeys will get packed onto the backs of mules or donkeys because it's easier. Or maybe you have a cart. Maybe not a cart because carts are a bit awkward unless you're on a road. But you'll pack up what you can, and you may travel in armor. You may pack your armor. It depends.
Okay.
It really depends on the tactical situation and how likely you think you are to encounter someone where you'll need your armor.
Right.
And you may be wearing some of it, but not all of it. So it's quite common Sir Philip Sidney famously got killed with a blow to the leg because he'd gone off to battle without his leg armor. He decided not to bother with it. He left it in his tent and regretted it.
Oh no.
So, there isn't one answer. You would, and again, it depends on the period, depends on all sorts of things. You will generally find that when you get off your horse, you have your sword and your dagger on you.
Okay.
Right? They're not generally attached to the horse.
Okay.
I mean, like in a cowboy movie, you'll see saddles which have a holster for the rifle, and similarly, um, when riding with a lance, you'll have a thing to stick the foot of your lance in. So you tend to
Mm-hmm.
ride with the lance vertical, and it's resting in a basically it's being supported by the saddle because you have a special cup
Okay.
to put it in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So long arms tend to have things on the horse that will help you carry it.
Okay.
Shorter weapons like swords and daggers will tend to be on your person. So if you fall off your horse, the sword and the dagger will fall with you,
Okay.
which is
That makes
bloody
sense.
uncomfortable, got to say.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, that ties directly into the next question, which is about sheaths and ways that you wear,
Mm-hmm.
your sidearms and your shorter weapons on your person. Um, I know, I know enough to know that back sheaths are really only, well, not very practical, but certainly not for anything that's like longer than your arm. Like you couldn't have like a long sword on your back and draw it per se. But then there's like hip sheaths and stuff like that. Are there any other options like historically or any thoughts on
I
sheaths,
mean,
I guess?
there are varieties in the way that it's carried on the hip, but
Mm,
almost all swords, almost all the time, are carried on the non-dominant side hip. So if you're a right-hander, it'll be on your left hip. If you're a left-hander,
mm,
it's on your right hip. And your dagger will be on your right hip, generally speaking, or
okay,
maybe slightly behind you. But so it's easily accessed by the right hand on the right-hand side, and the sword is on the left, so it's easily accessed by the right hand on the left-hand side. Yeah,
right.
because you need that cross draw for the length of the weapon. Yeah.
Yeah,
So if I'm actually I've got a sword in the sheath right here. So here I can quite easily get the sword out, and it's a bloody long sword. I mean, it's
mm,
getting on for
right,
40 now. Um, if it was on my right hand side, I could just about, if I really stretch, but that's
right,
hard work. That's difficult.
right. And you can't
Yeah.
quickly draw it and be
Yeah.
ready to go.
So, but a short dagger, easy peasy. But
Mm,
this, easy. So you wouldn't, I mean, anytime anybody says, in history, this happened, you will find an example that proves that person wrong for making a blanket statement, right?
right,
For instance, the Vikings did not use two-handed swords. This is generally true. But if I remember rightly, there's been at least one two-handed sword from the Viking period and Viking culture found. So at least
right.
one Viking had a two-handed sword. Fucker.
Just the one
just,
guy.
just, just to mess with the historical record, right?
Right.
So, you know, so what I'm about to say, take it into that context. We do not find any examples of people carrying swords on their backs at all, right?
Okay.
In Europe, right? Now, it
Right.
may be so that, if you don't want, if you're running through a field or something, and you take off your sword belt and you wrap it around you, and you have it on your back like that for some reason, because you're
Mm,
just trying to transport it across a
right.
distance rather than actually carry it to be used, you
Right.
might. But if the sword is properly hung, you can run in it. It just sits there
Right.
as you run. Um, I mean, I have a friend who does arms and armor conservation for a living, and while he was making his medieval armor and swords and whatnot, to
Mm,
test the thing he had for his sword, he just wore the sword all day in his workshop while he was doing his job. No problem.
right. Okay.
Because, I mean, yeah, if it's quite a long sword, it will tend to flap about a bit and you can like bump it into furniture or whatever.
Right.
Um, but generally speaking, it just sits there. And there are ways of carrying the sword that's more vertical,
Mm,
right? Generally speaking, a longer sword will be more horizontal. But
yeah.
we have some indication that some swords were carried rather more vertically. And of course, in certainly in, shall we say, late 14th century Italy, it was quite common for your longsword to be carried in its scabbard, not attached to the belt. So you
Hmm.
would walk around town like that, right? So
Okay.
when you got to the house where you were going, you would hand your sword to the butler, or I mean, that's not their proper title, but you get the idea. You hand your sword to
Hmm.
the butler, and you still have your dagger on you, of course, because you're but
Yeah.
it's the sword that indicates you're armed, not the dagger.
Right. Okay.
Um, and armed in medieval period generally means wearing armor, not carrying a weapon,
Okay.
because everyone's got a weapon
Okay.
all the time. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, you might carry the sword literally just in your hand, or your servant might
Hmm.
carry it for you.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, but again, this is cultural. This is context
Right.
dependent, and
Hmm.
I mean, everyone knows ninjas carry swords on their backs, right? Because I've seen it in the movies, so it must be true. I think I put it in sword fighting for writers and whatnot,
Hmm.
um, where I think it was Joe Abercrombie. He has a character who has a long sword in a back scabbard, but the back
Hmm.
scabbard has this sort of quasi magical property where you basically it unzips as you pull it out, and it zips itself up again when you put it back. So you don't
Right.
have to
Yeah.
actually. You're not hauling it up. You're just
Hmm.
grabbing the handle and pulling it
And
down,
right.
right? And if that was a real thing, I could see that being quite cool.
Right.
Um, but clearly, I think it was Joe Abercrombie. Clearly, he just wanted a back scabbard, knew all of the counter arguments for why they're a stupid idea, and came up with a solution that let him have the thing he wanted in the universe he created. And more power to him. That was great. I mean, when I read that,
Right.
I was like, that was cool. Right?
Right.
That wasn't a stupid back scabbard. That was a
No.
cool back scabbard.
Right.
Because
Very
it actually worked.
intentional.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so last question in that section is would you travel with practice swords or backup swords, or would you mostly only travel with the actual, like, sharp sword weapon or, that you were fighting with? I guess we could say not less sword and more like actual
Um,
fighting weapons versus training weapons.
well, okay. Are you on your way to a fencing tournament? If you are on your way to a fencing tournament, you might take practice gear with you.
Okay,
If you are a professional warrior traveling from place to
right.
place, you would not generally have a practice sword with you. Now, if you
Okay.
have a page with you and you're giving him sword fighting lessons on the way, and in your world, as sometimes they did in Europe, for instance,
Mhm.
you have wooden training weapons to practice with, and
Okay.
it was not inconvenient to pack them, then you'd
Mhm.
bring them with you. Or
Okay.
if you're going through forests and whatnot, you might just cut a stick and practice with that,
Right.
right? So if it makes sense to the story, yes. Um, and there are examples of um, people like bringing a bunch of. George Silver mentions this in his Paradoxes of Defense. Um, there are examples where people would go to a place to teach fencing, and they would bring a bunch of wooden swords with them,
Okay.
right? But a practice sword is probably not a common thing for warriors to be traveling around with, in the same way that
Okay.
modern soldiers who are moving from one place to another in a military situation are not going to be carrying blank rounds.
Right. That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So, but again, if your story requires a couple of wooden wasters to be strapped to the back of the poor donkey carrying all of the other gear, by all means, why not?
Fair enough. Okay, so the last questions are plot related.
Mhm.
So the first one is about how long would it take for someone starting sword fighting or some sort of weapon combat training to be able to hold their own in a battle if they were training full time versus just training in their spare time?
Okay. Very difficult question to answer. It depends hugely on what kind of battle,
Okay.
what position they're supposed to hold in the
Mm,
military. Um,
mm,
I mean, a professional knight would have trained for about 8 to 10 years from the age of about 10,
Mm.
before they became a knight, right? It's equivalent to getting a commission in the army, I guess.
Mm.
Same sort of like professional soldier. But the militias in Italy in the 14th century that defended the towns were townspeople. They were not professional soldiers. So they would hire
Right.
professional soldiers to lead them, but the militia would turn out and they would be expected to have trained to a certain degree with the various weapons. There would be a company of crossbow people, probably, maybe later on, people with muskets, people who are manning the defenses of the walls, people who are have been drilling with pikes or spears or whatever else. There's a if you're of that social class, military service is expected, right?
Right.
But again, it is massively dependent on context.
Okay. That makes
So
sense.
if you have a bunch of people who have been training every weekend for 3 years and they come up against a bunch of people who've been training every day for 10 years, unless there's a massive technological superiority on the amateur side, the professionals are going to
Mm.
win.
Right.
Yes.
Right. If
Right.
you're
But most armies aren't composed that way and never have been.
right.
Most armies historically have had a core of professionals and a bunch of conscripts or recruits or whatever else.
Okay.
And, gentlemen from Verona would be effectively officers in the militia, and tradesmen were likely to be like the rank and file.
Okay.
So, I mean, people do training because it works. So
Mm.
whatever you're writing should reflect that,
Right.
right? But the actual answer is entirely dependent on the context of this universe you've created, and
Right.
also entirely dependent on the kind of battle that they have. Because I mean,
Mm.
I have met some pretty damned unfit professional soldiers because they are professional. They're in the military, but their job is mostly admin. Making sure the
Right.
right stores go to the right place at the right time, and that's super important. But it doesn't require them to be very fit, right?
Right.
So there's a professional soldier who isn't that fit, but there are people who joined the U.S. military after 9/11 who came from fields like American football, like professional
Mm.
athletes. They are ridiculously fit,
Right.
right? So again, it's not a simple question to answer.
Right.
Um, and what kind of battle are we talking about?
Mm.
Morale has at least as big an effect, I would say, as physical fitness, but the two tend to be connected. The fitter you tend to be, the more morale you're likely to have because you'll feel
Okay.
more prepared.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Um,
So
but sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, what about in the scenario where because you don't tend to see a lot of like actual battles being portrayed at that scale, or at least not correctly, right? In a lot of fantasy books, especially.
Mm-hmm.
So what about in the slightly less historical application of like you have a small group of people like going on a quest who might encounter some sort of like less structured enemy forces, like think your Lord of the Rings quest, right?
Mm-hmm.
For someone trying to train up to defend themselves in that sort of a scenario where they're not having to fight in formations or anything in a actual structured battle format, but like more Lord of the Rings quest, what kind of training or preparation would that take?
Okay. Well, formation is easier to train for.
Okay.
It's a much
Okay.
more restricted set of skills, right?
Right.
So,
Okay.
so if you're basically skirmishing or dueling
Mm-hmm.
and you're not working as a unit, you have to be able to deal with all sorts of things in all sorts of ways, and you need to be generally like fitter and have better tactical awareness and all that sort of thing.
Okay.
But you know, soldiers in wartime go from civilian to the battlefield in maybe 2 months,
Okay.
maybe three. maybe even quicker, depends, right?
Right.
Because if they're just being trained to do as they're told by the professionals, then they just have to be fit enough to carry the gear and trained to shoot or to use the weapon
Right.
to destroy the enemy, or whatever that tends to mean, and
Okay.
to work as a unit and to do and make the unit work as a tactical piece on the board, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a much more restricted set of skills than like general combat. So yeah, I mean, the things you need to train are like speed, power, strength, agility, tactical awareness, technical stuff like, weapons techniques and unarmed techniques, all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Ideally, though, your group, if it is finds itself in a combat situation, will work as a group,
Right.
right?
Okay.
Where, for example, you might have, an archer being defended by, having somebody covering their back so that they can shoot people at range and not be snuck up on from behind, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Right. That
And
makes sense.
so, yeah, the, there are just so many variables there. It's impossible to say.
That's fair. That's fair.
But
It's
fitness is always good. Strength is always good. Agility is always
mm,
good. Tactical awareness is always good. Technical skill is always good. It's
right.
just how much of which you need will depend entirely on the specifics of what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, because you tend to see a lot of scenes where like you have these like brief training montages where like
Yeah.
for some reason your POV character joins up with this group of fighters and then they get, you know, trained up and they fight with them for some reason. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty common trope that always feels a little bit like weird in the timelines of how it all works out and stuff. Like,
Mm.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you'd expect military training to take weeks or months,
Mhm.
and like professional training is ongoing, and it starts with 8 or 10 years of being trained as a knight from the age of 10,
Mhm.
ideally,
Right,
in,
which
in,
is
in a kind of pre-industrial kind of medieval type situation. And
right.
you know, a I mean, the stories of some of the knights, should we say, the knights of great renown from 15th century Europe, some of the things they could do were just astonishing, and they were
Right.
killing machines.
Yeah.
So your average someone with a few weeks training or a few months training up against a professional knight in the context for which he has trained, they're toast.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that lines up with what like just from the very brief experience that I have with sword fighting and sparring and stuff. I'm like,
Hmm. Yeah.
I don't know about that. So the next question is say you have someone that's like training, like we're talking about that
Mm-hmm.
training montage again. What are some of the initial patterns you might identify and guide your teaching style to? So let's give a slightly more specific context. Let's say you're training someone to be able to defend themselves with a sidearm in like more of a self-defense sort of a scenario,
Okay.
right? Or just teaching someone to fight with a sidearm, we'll say a sword. Is there anything that like their personality or like their I guess like them as a character in general, right? It could be personality, could be like physical that would guide how the training for that person would necessarily go.
Um, Again, massively context dependent.
Yeah,
Um, it all depends on what you're training them to do. Like, is it a
right.
duel with someone, a prearranged fight between two social equals, or is it the battlefield, or is it
Mm.
just getting them a little bit better able to look after themselves as they walk across town?
Yeah. Let's say
Um,
that. Let's say it's like a self defense kind of a thing.
yeah, it's tricky because the self defense again. What is the legal situation, right?
Right.
Can they use lethal force or not? Should they
Hmm.
use lethal force or not? That's a consideration, particularly in self defense. Um,
Okay.
like the best, I mean, if you're honestly teaching someone self-defense, the thing you should teach them is to not go to the places where they would need any kind of actual physical skills, right?
Right.
So it's
Fair.
situational
Yeah.
awareness and recognizing the warning signs that are usually there before things turn to shit,
Okay.
right? So, don't walk down the dark alleyway, for instance.
Reasonable.
Um, don't look like a worthwhile target, right? So, I mean, people will attack you for lots of different reasons. They will attack you maybe to steal your money. So if you look like
Mhm.
you haven't got any money, they may not bother to attack you,
Right.
right? And also looking kind of tougher and scarier makes that less likely. But
Mhm.
they may attack you for status purposes,
Mhm.
right? Common in gangs, right? In which case, being a bit tougher makes you a more attractive target. There's
Right.
there's no street cred to be had beating up a little old man, right? So why would you bother, right? There's plenty of street cred to be had beating up a young, fit, strong-looking person,
Mhm.
right? So understanding why people are likely to attack you and how they're likely to do it and for what reasons, that's
Mhm.
where you tend to go. Like self-defense that focuses on like martial arts technique is not
Okay.
self-defense at all. It just
Right.
it's a totally irresponsible way to train anyone.
Okay.
Um, and especially you see these women's self-defense classes where how to escape from a grab from behind. Like, yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Right. Honestly, how to escape from a grab from behind? Go train BJJ for 3 years. So when
Yeah.
somebody grabs you from behind, you're used to it, and you have a shitload of
Mhm.
stuff you can do, and you don't suddenly freeze and wet yourself because you're absolutely terrified. And
Right.
you know, oh, it's a Tuesday night, right? Someone's grabbing from behind. I'm used to it, and usually the person grabbing a woman from behind is going to be bigger and stronger and
Mhm.
have clearly far less socialization about hurting people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the first thing you have to train the person is the willingness to do serious fucking damage right now, without
Yeah.
hesitation, immediately. There's a stimulus, boom, 100% to the max. Do something super nasty, like
Right.
I don't know, have a steel propelling pencil and stick it into their nuts or their eye,
Right.
right?
Yeah, it
But
has
most
to be
people,
a
most people
reflex to
won't
be
do,
useful.
yeah, but most people won't do that, or they won't do it
Yeah.
hard enough and fast enough because they're frightened of the consequences, and quite right.
Mhm.
Because you really have no business teaching someone to, if someone startles them from behind, you blind them.
Mhm.
That's not an
Right.
appropriate response, right? So it's
Right.
super hard. It's super hard. So you've picked by far the most difficult scenario to train a person for, which is actual self-defense. It is
Right. But it's
stupid,
so common
and
in books.
yeah, but I don't do it at all. I don't teach
Yeah.
self-defense to anyone. I teach historical
Mhm.
martial arts, and the context for which it occurs, it doesn't exist anymore. So it's completely obsolete. So I don't have to worry about the ethics of teaching people to murder each other, and
Yeah.
because that's my area of interest, right?
Mhm.
And there's quite a lot of the technical material we find in, for example, medieval Italian combat, that you will also find on a modern self-defense in huge fucking scare quotes.
Mhm.
Um, but they're not actually related in any way because the fundamental attitude behind them is completely different,
Right. That makes
right?
sense.
So, yeah, I mean, you train self-defense by teaching someone where not to go,
Yeah.
basically, and what to look for,
Mhm.
like, and you know, don't get drunk. Like, get drunk in your house
Right.
or with your close friends who you deeply trust, but do not get drunk in public ever,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Because if you're interested in self-defense, I mean, I've gotten
Mhm.
drunk in public many times, and I don't care. That's because I'm not worried about self-defense because I only
Right.
tend to go to places where self-defense isn't a requirement.
Right.
you know.
Right.
Actually, interesting self-defense moment. One of the very few kind of real-ish situations in a pub in Helsinki many years ago. I was sat there chatting to my friend, and this old mid-60s Irish bloke took offense at my English accent. Right, and this was 20 years ago, not long after the Good Friday peace agreement of 1998. So the trouble's not long over, and there's still a bit of tension there, right? And he sort of asked if he can join us, and so he's sitting there chatting, and he's getting more and more aggressive, and he picks up this big heavy glass ashtray. This is back in the days where you could smoke in pubs. Picked up this
Right.
big heavy glass ashtray, and he's sort of gesticulating with it like this, but his elbow is on the table, right? So while the elbow's on the table, he's not going to hit anybody. So I'm sitting back, I have my hands out in front of me, and I've decided what I'm going to do if the elbow leaves the table. That's the trigger. If the elbow leaves
Right.
the table,
Okay.
I will do this thing, right? I look past him over his shoulder, and there's the barman, and I look at the barman, and I give him the kind of, keeping my peripheral vision on the elbow, but
Right.
so the barman comes over, identifies the situation. This is one of the best bits of martial arts I've ever seen in my life, right? He takes this rather drunk Irish guy's pint off the table and says, I'm just going to put this over here. And he puts it on a table. I think you should go get your pint. Right? So the guy
Right.
puts the ashtray down and goes and sits over there and drinks his pint. End of problem.
That's great. Like the recognition of the danger of that and being able to redirect it and keep it from actually
Right.
happening is
Yeah.
a lot more useful, probably.
Right. And let the record show. My kind of physical altercation preparation response was like very basic level, rather stupid. It would have worked, but it would have had a very nasty outcome, and there would have been probably an ambulance and probably talking to police officers, and probably it wouldn't have been pleasant for anybody. It would have been a disaster.
Right.
Right. But that was all I could think of at the time because I was a lot younger than I am now. Right. But the barman, he was a martial artist. Right. He just solved the situation. No stress, no impact, nothing. Done. It was an object lesson in self-defense.
It really brings to mind. I can't remember who it's by. Anyone who's heard of it will know exactly who it's by, but I'm horrible with names. I can't remember. But I've been reading The Art of War.
Oh yeah, Sun Tzu.
It's very in line with the tactics of that. Like
yeah, Sun Tzu.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. He identifies different ground. Basically, it's better to leave your enemy a way to retreat. Because if they're on deadly ground, they will fight to the death. If they have no way to retreat, they will fight to the max. But if they have a way out, they will tend to take it. Yeah.
Right.
And
right.
Yeah, it was, man.
It's a very
one of the best martial arts classes of my entire life was sitting and having that pint.
That is a great story. It leaves a lot of room also open for characters that can be in and be very successful in very like high stress, dangerous situations and be able to deal with them in ways that don't necessarily require them to be, professional sword fighters or professional fighters of some regard.
Yeah, I mean, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like nails. But and if you're totally into the swords and fighting with swords, you will tend to want to solve these things with sword fights. But actually, very often, there are better solutions to a particular problem.
Yeah. That makes sense. So, slightly different scenario, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the really, really common things that you see in a lot of fantasy, especially like YA fantasy, is you see the big like tournaments or the big like competition focus plots. So if you were trying to train someone for not self-defense, but specifically for fighting in this specific tournament, they're usually like fight to the death, like, there's Hunger Games, there's all the Kotar stuff,
Okay.
there's
I
Like
mean,
that kind of
historically, most tournaments weren't fight to the death; they were fight to the armor.
right, right.
So if two knights are fighting in the tournament, the one who wins that bout gets the other person's horse and armor,
Okay.
right? Generally speaking, which is
Hmm.
worth a fuck ton of money. All right, so the stakes are pretty high, but they don't
Hmm.
tend. You don't tend to go into tournaments to fight to the death. I mean, people could
Right,
get killed, but that wasn't the intention.
right.
Tournaments were basically preparation for war, and the fact is, I mean, imagine if you've been saving up and you've got yourself like the best car you can
Hmm.
possibly afford, and it's cost an absolute fortune, and you go to a race meet, and the winner keeps the loser's car. That's the level of psychological stress we're talking about.
Hmm.
Um, so, I mean, assuming we're talking about a medieval style tournament, fighting in armor and whatnot, an awful lot of it will be physical conditioning because
Okay.
armor is heavy. I mean, it's not that
Hmm.
heavy, but it's like maybe 25 kilos, 50, 55 pounds, something like that.
Okay.
And it's tiring to run around in.
Hmm.
My friend Daniel Jacquet, Dr. Daniel Jacquet,
Hmm.
has done these fantastic videos of conditioning in armor, and he has this absolutely superb one of um, him in his full knightly armor, a firefighter, and a modern soldier going over an assault course together. Right? They raced an assault
Oh,
course together, and they come out almost even.
okay.
Right? They all did it in some plus or minus 20 seconds, around 3 minutes. Right?
Hmm.
It's stunning to watch because you can see that the level of restriction that the equipment is giving you is approximately equivalent to a firefighter or to a modern soldier, and you are still able, if you're trained for it, to go over an
Right.
assault course. Right?
That's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, you
Um,
train for what you have to
yeah.
do. Like, you would
Yeah.
have to do that. So,
So in the tournament, you would ideally you would know who they're going to fight, and you would prepare
hmm.
them to meet that particular opponent. So
Okay.
this person is left-handed and likes to use a poleaxe. Okay, so you're going to be doing a lot of training against a left-handed poleaxe stuff, for instance.
Right.
Um, or you would train them in the rules of the tournament. What precisely are the rules? Like
Hmm.
in many cases, if your back touches the barriers, you lose,
Hmm.
right? So there may be a situation where the right thing to do is to train the person to get their opponent immobilized to the point that they can push them backwards so they hit the barriers,
Okay.
right?
That makes sense.
For
Yeah.
instance, because it's a tournament winning move. Throws
Hmm.
are also generally considered tournament winning moves,
Okay.
right?
Maybe
So if
just
you throw
throw
the person to the
somebody.
ground, yeah. So
Hmm.
if you throw them on the ground, you win generally. So if that's the case in that tournament, you might want to emphasize throws. So
Hmm.
you would customize the technical content to the
Okay.
specific tournament, but you would generally focus, as modern MMA fighters do now,
Right.
you would generally focus on physical conditioning because that will make a
Okay.
world of difference.
Right. How long do you think? I know it's so like rough, but like, are we talking like someone would probably need at least months or years to prepare for this sort of a thing?
Depends on the starting point.
That's fair. That's fair. Say someone that
Right.
like has
Okay.
some
I have
general
I have a
fitness.
student. I have a student who started at the age of 10. He's been training for
Okay.
20 years. He's been training daily for nearly 20 years.
Mm.
He just hasn't done the armored stuff.
Okay.
So for him, I would say 3 to 6 months of conditioning to the armor, and he's ready.
Okay.
He's
Okay.
got all the technical stuff. All he needs is the armor and the physical conditioning to wear the armor and move properly in the armor, fit the armor correctly, get used to the weight. 3 to 6 months. Given his age and
Okay.
background, that's plenty.
Right.
I have another friend who is already totally conditioned to the armor. Um, all he would need would be the specific technical coaching, probably a few
Mm.
weeks,
Okay. Okay. So if someone
right?
was generally someone who would be willingly entering into this sort of tournament, right? They're
Hmm.
in shape, they do stuff, whatever,
And
like a few weeks, maybe a
okay,
month preparing for the specifics.
right. And again, medieval tournaments would tend to be knights only or knights and squires,
Right.
right? So you're of a certain social class. You've had all the training already, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can't just decide one day, well, I'm a wealthy merchant. I can afford to buy some armor. And there's a tournament coming up in 6 months. I shall train for the tournament like they do in reality TV, right?
Right.
Because you wouldn't be allowed to fight because you're not a knight. You're not a squire. You're
Right.
a merchant who's bought some armor. Not the same thing,
Right.
right?
Yeah, no.
So generally speaking, medieval tournaments were not open to people who were not already basically trained for them.
Mm-hmm.
And
That makes sense.
that's to do with like social snobbery, not to do with like safety concerns or anything like that.
Right. Right. Okay, so the next question is more focused on like the type of sword fighting instructing that you do when you teach.
Okay.
So, do you have a few like general strategies that you use when you teach people that have different like advantages or disadvantages? So, like if they're short or tall, different like kind of styles of teaching them versus like someone who's naturally a lot stronger or a lot weaker, stuff like that.
Okay. My style of teaching is generally the same for everyone, but it's adapted. The specifics are adapted for the individual. So, generally speaking, my style of teaching is the student tells me what their goals are. We agree what they should be practicing, and then I create an environment where they will fail at the optimal rate.
Okay.
Right? So they will learn as fast as they reasonably can. Okay? So that's the teaching style. The specifics of what I would teach, of course, would vary depending on their height and their weight and their strength and their speed and their temperament and what they tend to like to do. I mean, I'm a
Okay.
hitter, not a wrestler. I have
Okay.
students who are much more wrestlers than they are hitters. So, you know, I have students who are 6'8" and students who are under 4 foot.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be madness to train them to do the same thing.
Right.
Right. So it's, yeah, you would, I mean, basically, like the height thing, height gives you reach, but it gives you a high center of gravity. So it's great for
Okay.
hitting from far away, but you're vulnerable to a short person coming in for a takedown. So if you're a
Okay.
short person dealing with a tall person, your goal is to get in as close as you can, or to the necessary level of closeness, depending on what you want to do. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And your goal as the tall person is to keep the short person at arm's length.
Right.
Right. So the tall person should be trying to use their height to keep the person away and hit them from a distance where the shorter person can't hit them. And the shorter person
Mm-hmm.
should, of course, their whole strategy should be about getting inside that range where if my sword point is here
Mm-hmm.
and you're here, it's difficult for me to hit you.
Right.
Right. But if you're here, it's easy for me to hit you. Yeah. So you want to get inside the tall person's range and then do horrible damage with whatever the appropriate style requires.
Right.
You could be throwing them, you could be locking them, you could be stabbing them, whatever. Likewise, if someone is strong, particularly strong, the difficulty with strength is that you can use it to mask technical inferiority. So
Mm-hmm.
it's really impressive when you see someone who is very big and very, very strong, who is still extremely skilled. Right?
Okay.
I mean, one of the most impressive martial artists I've ever seen in my life is a guy called Ellis Amdur. He's in Seattle,
Okay.
and he's like 6'7", and he is built like a Greek god, and he's ridiculously strong. He is also perhaps the most technically skilled martial artist I have ever met. Like, it's unreal what he can do,
Right.
and it's got nothing to do with him being big and strong. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
how the hell did you get past the massive disadvantage of having a massive advantage and still learn that stuff?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, everything else being equal, size and strength are an advantage. There's no getting around
Mm-hmm.
that. But everything isn't equal. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm blanking on his name, but the leader of the English Knights at Agincourt, right, was
Mm-hmm.
famously short. right? He was like 5'2" or something, and his favorite weapon was a poleaxe, right? And
Mm-hmm.
he was one of the most feared knights in Europe, and he was taking out people who were a foot taller than him, no problem,
Right.
because he was a really good knight.
Right.
So yeah, you have to teach people to take advantage of their assets and to
Mm-hmm.
compensate for their disadvantages. It's just part of the job, really.
Right. So if someone, when people come to you to learn how to fight in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they don't have any personal like preferences, like something specific they want to learn based off their advantages or disadvantages, like would you recommend different like weapons or approaches for them to start with?
Um, okay. The thing that I'm really trying to teach my students most of the time
Mm.
is to be an autotelic personality, right?
Okay.
Set your own goals and to basically to access flow through
Mm.
taking control of your environment.
Mm.
Okay. So I would teach them to have preferences, right? So when I teach a seminar, I show
Mm.
up and I literally have a notebook and a pen like a waiter, and I say, okay, so why am I here? What do you want? And my students who know me have stuff prepared, and those who've not been to a seminar with me before are sometimes a little bit like, oh, I wasn't aware, right? And I'll ask them what they want me to cover, and I will teach them that, because as
Right.
the instructor, it is not my job to tell them what they should want. It's my
Okay.
job to
Yeah.
help them accomplish their goals, right?
Mm.
And you think of this historically, my favorite example, Salvatore Fabris was fencing master to King Christian IV of Denmark. So when Fabris was giving him a fencing lesson, who was in charge in that room?
Not him.
It's the king. The king
Right.
doesn't stop being the king just because he's holding a fencing foil. Well, before
Right.
foils were invented properly, but you get the idea, right? I mean, it's the king. The king wants to be better at
Mm.
fencing because the king has decided he likes to learn this newfangled Italian rapier stuff. And so he's got
Right.
this Fabris fellow out of Italy to come and teach him. And so Fabris will teach the king what he wants to learn. Right?
Mm.
Likewise, Fiore de Liberi wrote his Il Fiore di Battaglia, and it's to his probably patron, the Marquis of Ferrara.
Mm.
Fiore was the son of a knight, but not himself a knight.
Right.
His patron, Niccolo d'Este, is the Marquis of fucking Ferrara. He is one of the most powerful
Right.
noblemen in the whole of Italy, right? Again, if Fiore is giving Niccolo a sword fighting lesson, who is in charge in that room?
Right. Definitely not the instructor in that case. Yeah.
Right. If you hired a plumber to come and fix your toilet,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
Who is in
Yeah.
charge? Now, the plumber can say, I'm very sorry, the thing you're asking me to do, I can't do because the technology doesn't exist. Or
Right.
the plumber may say, well, actually, you really have to stop throwing books you don't like down the toilet. It's not good for it, right?
Fair.
But the relationship is you have hired this professional to solve a problem for you.
Mm.
You have not joined the army,
Right. Yeah. That's
right?
very different. Yeah.
Right. So I am not in the business of telling my students what they should want. I'm in the business of helping my students accomplish their goals. So if they're not sure what those goals are, I ask them what they think is cool.
Mm.
And long swords, rapiers, pick a sword that speaks to you. Oh,
Mm.
you like spears? Oh yeah, fuck the swords. We'll use spears instead. Fine. So we start with spears. No problem.
Right. Right.
Right. If it's within my competence, I'm happy to start there. It doesn't actually matter where you start. It matters that by the end of the process, the student has, in a way that is good for them physically and psychologically, moved closer to their goal.
Right. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense, actually. Yeah. Yeah, so that is all the questions I had. I really appreciate you coming on here and talking about this. This has been great. Definitely learned a lot. Need to go back through and make a ton of notes, but it's been absolutely wonderful.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been lovely to meet you.
Yeah, it's been great.